I think this is one where we want to keep the heat down. Otherwise, it'll get unintelligent and unintelligible.
I think it's always been unintelligent, but I agree with the unintelligible. Welcome to Unqualified Opinion. It's like your favorite podcast, just without the engaging material or humorous banter. How's it going, Scott?
It's like a lot of podcasts out there, I think. Do you know there's stats on like the number of podcasts created? It is phenomenal. I mean, the amount of crap that Americans churn out and the amount of crap they have stored in their brains that they want to blather about is pretty amazing. And this is just one of those many. We think it's slightly worse, which gives us the advantage in some ways because we're even less informed. Or maybe it's better to say we talk about topics about which we know even less than other people talk about.
Yeah, if nothing else, it is a unique niche just in how completely unqualified we are when we're talking about complex topics.
Well, I think that's actually important. I don't think we talk about that enough because some of people, people who listen to this, might think that these are our true opinions, and it's not really. That's not the case. I think a lot of times Steve and I engage in discussion where we don't actually agree in what we're arguing, but we do it anyway because it's interesting and it's intellectual for us at least. But I think that is something we don't mention often enough, and I think it's especially prudent to mention that today because we'll be talking about an especially charged topic. And I'll let Steve introduce it, so I'll keep that suspense there in case you.
Sure. And I think before we just jump right in, you make a really good point, Scott. And I just want to stop and assess this point a little bit more before we actually jump in.
Also, I need another drink. So.
Oh yes, definitely. But I think often. There's this phrase, and I don't remember who said it, but it goes kind of along the lines of you should have strong opinions loosely held. And I think both Scott and I kind of subscribe to this idea where we both are, I would say, relatively intellectually curious. And so we're both interested in exploring many different ideas, but we don't let our self-identity get coupled into a particular opinion. And what's really important about that is when you're having debates with people and someone disagrees with you and they have a differing opinion on a certain topic, you want to understand that their arguments against that topic aren't a argument against your moral character or your person, right? And so when Scott and I have disagreements, we both know that it's not an attack on each other, but just a way to dig deeper into a conversation around ideas. And that's what we always try to do, although sometimes it does get a little bit heated, and that's just par for the course because we're both human. And so today we're going to be talking about structural racism. And before we get into that, I think we should start with drinks. Or did you have something else you want to say first?
No, I thought it was institutional racism.
Oh, are those not the same thing?
Oh, this is a fascinating discussion on the podcast. Oh, we'll hold that. Well, and there's systemic racism as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear your definitions of all three. I don't know as much about these definitions, so I kind of lumped them all in the same category. So this will be very interesting. But before we get into that, let's talk about drinks.
So we've tried twice to talk about the presidential election and failed both times. It's something really tricky, I think, to talk about, but I had this drink the last time we were talking about that, so it's old news to you, Steve, but we didn't post that podcast. So it's whiskey sour, and it is. I love drinks where you can. It has 3 ingredients, 4 at the most, because I can't keep. I don't like to look at a recipe, and I like it when the ratio is clear. And so this one's 2 parts simple syrup, 3 parts lemon juice, 4 parts whiskey. So it's very easy to remember. Two, three, four.
That's a
Um,
lot of whiskey,
yeah, it
depending on how you
is.
define a part.
Well, I mean, yeah, yeah, part could be a lot.
A part could be one shot and you are wasted.
Yeah. Um,
What? How are
so
you defining a part here?
well, part is what the measuring cup easily measures. So it's I think 2 ounces is every
You
so
mean the
every
one that comes as the cap on a shaker?
no. It's like every I'm doing it in milliliters, but it like I put it's just like 50 milliliters to an ounce approximately, and so I do like 50 milliliters to 2 ounces. So I do 50 milliliters of whiskey, which is 2 ounces of whiskey, 40
How does that
milliliters of
compare to
lemon
a shot?
juice.
How much is one
A
shot?
shot is a shot's an ounce and a half, so it's like a little bit more than a shot.
Okay.
So, but I like ratios because then you can make it as big or as small as you want. I mean, as big as you want.
Nice correction. I like it. I like where your mind's at. And also, we usually do this podcast on Sundays, but today we're doing it on a Saturday. So we might be getting a little bit more wild today since we don't have work tomorrow. We'll see how this happens. I've actually already finished one drink, and I'm on my second drink. And similar to Scott, I'm drinking the same thing that I did last week. But since we scrapped that recording, I'm just going to say it again. I'm drinking a Negroni, which is even easier in terms of the recipe than Scott's. It is 3 items, same as Scott's, but it is one part of each item.
Oh,
So it is 1 part gin, 1 part sweet vermouth, and 1 part Campari. Except what I do, because when you follow that recipe, it's a little bit too sweet. I pared down the Campari and the sweet vermouth to maybe like 3/4 apart. So it's not quite as elegant. But I wanted to say it 1 1 1.
you mean you just add more whiskey?
Yeah, of course. No, it's gin. It's gin. So,
Gin. I'm
so,
sorry,
so
gin.
my correction is this: it's 1 part gin, 1 part Campari, 1 part sweet vermouth, and then a splash or 2 or 3 of more gin. So yeah, no, it's good. It's a good drink. It's hard to have many of them, but I'm running out of other drinks, so I'm gonna have to. As we mentioned before, we're gonna be talking, I guess, about racism and the general kind of structural and institutional forms of racism that exist, and different perspectives around what racism is, what racism isn't, the impact of racism on our society and our culture. I think this is a really difficult conversation to be had because it's very emotionally laden for a lot of people, and also because I think it's fair to say that neither of us are significant victims of any kind of perpetuated racism. I'm, like, I guess, quote unquote partially a minority, but it doesn't, it barely so, let's say. And Scott's white, so it makes it a lot. I guess the best way to phrase this is that there are perspectives that through our lived experiences we are most likely missing, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't have the conversation. We should just be careful about how we're approaching the conversation. And so, with all of that said, I think the place we should start with this conversation is defining some terms, right? Starting with the idea of maybe racism in the conventional sense and structural racism in, let's say, the leftist postmodern sense, for lack of a better term. And so I would define racism as it's conventionally seen as discrimination against individuals or groups of people based on their racial or ethnic characteristics, right? There's a tendency in some parts of the woke sphere to say that it is privilege plus power, which excludes certain groups from being able to be racist. But I don't think it's worth talking about that right now. Let's stick with conventional definitions. Does that seem like a fair way of defining racism to you?
Yeah, we probably want to keep this conversation somewhat limited to us to well, I guess it's very hard to define a line necessarily between personal animosity towards someone of another race, or personal bias, or on biases that you're unaware of, versus kind of the way rules and laws and institutions are created, which of course are created by people who may or may not harbor racist tendencies. But I think my understanding was we would focus more on the latter than on the former, just because it's such a deep and broad
Hmm.
topic that we can't cover the waterfront.
Yeah, and that's fair. Yeah, let's definitely try to do that. Given the track record of this podcast, I doubt we will be able to keep within the lanes that we originally set ourselves with. That tends to be what happens. But yeah, why don't we try to start with that? So there is a distinction between the notion of kind of individual or personal racism, where it's a specific individual who harbors some kind of discriminatory feelings or acts on those feelings and manifests discriminatory behaviors towards certain racial groups, and structural racism, which, and again, I think the definitions are important. So correct me if you disagree with this definition. But structural racism, which basically states that you can have a system that is built through a complex history that definitely is laden with discrimination and racism, such that even if in its current standing there is no individual racist in the kind of chain of power, like none of those individuals are strictly racist, the system itself can harbor racist behaviors that tends to lead to, let's say, economic and social inequality for certain minority groups. I guess for certain ethnic or racial groups, let's say, to be more specific. Is that a fair definition of structural racism?
I think broadly I would agree with that. I think the one I would mention two things. One is an example, and one is just slight adjustment. I think it doesn't matter if one is racist or not in a structure that it's a can be or cannot be, but the structure is the one that's acting and causing the results. And so it's not that there isn't anyone who is racist or is racist. It just doesn't really matter. If you're not really thinking intentionally about what the outcomes are and you're just going along, you may be having adverse impacts without realizing. And this is also where it gets. I'm sorry, I'm deviating slightly, but this is also where it gets slightly difficult because you're not racist, but then you can talk about adverse, impacts or unequal impacts, where the way a system is set up, you're impacting one party much more than the other, or one group much more than the other. Um, and that may be based on racism or not. I mean, it may be designed on, it may be based, the system may have been set up with the best intentions in mind, but the impact is still adverse because people didn't think through far enough what the impacts would be. One example, though, I do want to use that I think is sort of structural racism or uh, I'll
Institutionalized
say
racism?
I would institutionalize racism. I wouldn't actually use that word in this case. Institutionalizing racism is that's a pretty narrow definition. Or
Mm.
structural racism would be the Georgia runoff, which is very timely. We have two Senate seats in Georgia, and none of the candidates were able to reach 50%, and therefore they have to go into runoff. That was actually designed with an explicit racist policy in mind, because black voters were assumed to want to vote in mass for a black candidate, whereas white votes would split among various candidates. And so, if the black candidate got the most votes, even if it wasn't 50%, they would be elected. And so across the South, and Georgia still has this. And again, it's not. If someone asked you right now, "Are you keeping the system in place because you're racist?" They would say no, and I would believe them. But the reason the system existed in the first place was to deny African American voters or African American senators the chance to become a senator, or candidates to become a senator. So that would be a really great
That's
example
interesting. That's
of
interesting.
a mechanism that's still in play. Does it make sense as much anymore? I don't think so, and I think that's great news because there's a very good chance that Tom Tillis, as African American, will win that race in the runoff. but it's probably less of a chance that he'll win it if it had just been open competitive. Whoever gets to the top first wins. You
So
know,
so I'm gonna push back a little bit on what you're saying, and I don't think it's what you're saying, but what was kind of what some people might interpret from what you said, right? And so there, part of what you were saying is that this explicit law in Georgia around the runoffs was created with clearly racist intent, right? I don't disagree with that. But therefore, it is an example of a system that is structurally racist and oppressive. I don't think that that necessarily is the case, because if you look at how the law influences voting patterns today, it's not obvious that there's a race based component to it. It's mostly a political component, right? So in the same way that you can have laws that are constructed that are not constructed with racist intent, having unintended racially influencing side effects, you can have the reverse as well. And that doesn't, just because a law was created originally with racist intent doesn't mean you should throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And that if someone takes that quote and posts it on YouTube, I can get canceled. But if you think about the realities of it, it's not clear to me that Georgia law is somehow discriminating against any racial population today.
yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about it to say whether it is or not. And I said I didn't want to talk about individual racism, but of course that if you're talking about the South, that brings you have to almost talk about it. Georgia is a state where you could look in the news and find recent-ish news stories of people doing mock lynchings of people, scarecrows or dummies that look like black people. I mean, and so racism is still deeply entrenched, but it's not especially in the South. And you can find this, and it's not hard. But does that have what is the relationship between that and then the actual institution and how the vote is set up today? And I think it's complicated because you can say, someone can say, well, a lot of not a lot. There's a subset of Georgians, perhaps they're primary voters. They have a lot of influence compared to others because they're primary voters. Some of them harbor racist tendencies. Those individuals may have a slightly larger voice because they're primary voters in the Republican Party, and you have to kind of listen to them if you want to be the nominee for that party. And so maybe your policy goes more towards, well, let's keep this law in place. Let's keep the. And again, I'm not saying this is happening, but I'm just saying, hypothetically. Well, okay, let's keep this runoff system in place because my constituents are saying they want that, and it's easy win, and I'll just do it. Is the politician, and again, I'm just kind of talking through this, is the politician racist? No. I mean, I would argue no in this hypothetical situation. They're responding to some constituents are saying, no, we want it this way or that way. And well, that's an easy win. I'll just give you that. And I'm not going to really think much more about it.
Yeah. The problem I have with this argument, sorry to interrupt you, Scott, is that there are legitimate reasons without introducing the racial component for having this law, right? Allowing multiple people to run and then choosing the top two for a runoff allows for people's votes to not be throwaway votes, right? And I don't want to get too hung up on this specific example because I think it's kind of a rabbit hole that we don't want to get into with so much other stuff to talk about. But I guess my point here is that yes, there can be racists who are voting, and yes, the law itself could have originally been created for racist intent, but the way it's written right now, there's nothing about it that is written to explicitly discriminate against certain groups of people based on the race,
right?
Or based on anything really. And so. If you have a last word on that, I'm happy to allow you to say it. But then after that, I do want to kind of get back to this higher level concept of structural racism because I have some thoughts there.
Well, all I was going to say is I think this shows how complicated it is because if you take what I said and what you said, they aren't actually contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it can be both. I mean, it can be it still exists because some people want it to exist because it supports their racist tendencies, but at least they think it does. But at the same time, it actually doesn't have an adverse impact because it allows a lot of other people to run.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it can be both, and I think that's what people miss with every conversation is that it's especially when it's complex as this is that there are multiple parties and multiple stakes involved
Mm-hmm.
and multiple outcomes or multiple possible outcomes. So I just want to throw it out there. I don't think what we're saying is really contradictory, it really in any way.
So one of the things I want to get back to, and I think that this is gonna start the like emotional flaring up, and I might start by going way too extreme here, but this idea of structural racism allowing for there to be no actual racist, and yet for the system to be racist itself is something that So in college, I was very heavily on the left, and the let's say the far left, and I'm not there anymore. And I very much subscribe to this notion of structural racism and this specific definition. Like, you don't need any racist in the chain, and yet the system itself can be racist because of a historical legacy of racism and because of implicit bias and laws that allow for some groups to be historically and continuously disenfranchised or whatever. Um, but I never really thought deeply about what that means. And I was trying to before we started this conversation, and I can't find the logical chain that says somehow there are no people who are racist, and yet the system is racist. Like, there's a missing link there. And there's I tried really hard to think of like, okay, let's make this theory work, and I can't, right? And so this reminds me a lot, and I think I talked to you about this, Scott, but I haven't talked about this on the podcast, about the notion of the God in the cracks, right? And so in the past, let's stick with the idea of Christianity for now to make this simple. People didn't know about science, and so there was a lot of unknown in the world. And so the realm of religion was to explain that unknown. And since the unknown was very large, a lot of the unknown phenomenon, including weather and disease, and the idea of consciousness and being and all of that, was explained by the notion of God. And as the Enlightenment happened and as science came in and as science explained a lot of these phenomenon, God got pushed further and further and further away from our lived reality, to the point that what we have now is what's called, I think it was Richard Dawkins who kind of defined the term of the God in the cracks, where it's like religion gets pushed back as far as the boundaries of what science is able to prove, right? And so religion is just the unknown realm, and that unknown realm gets smaller and smaller over time. And so structural racism, in a lot of ways, to me, feels the same way. Like, we have a history that's undoubtedly kind of riddled with many, many examples, overwhelming examples of extreme levels of racism. And let's say specifically in the U.S. for now, though, the U.S. is not unique to that. Racism, not just with slavery, but even after slavery, with Jim Crow laws and redlining and a lot of other issues which inscribed racism into our legal institutions. But with the civil rights movement, over time, what we've seen is a reduction of those, a dissolution of specifically race-based policies. And in conjunction with that, we've seen a massive reduction in overt signs of racism by individuals. I don't think by any means that you can completely eliminate racism. And that's another conversation to be had. So
That's a totally different podcast.
yeah, let's not get too far into that. But it feels like to me structural racism is really similar to this argument of the God in the cracks, because it's kind of like we're seeing these discrepancies, and I'm not disputing that, between different races in terms of their performance in our society, right? Whether it's educational attainment, wealth, income, life expectancy, whatever it is. And we're assuming that since we don't know exactly what's causing that it must be racism in some form. And so since we can't find overt examples in our legal structure, and we can't find overt examples outside of extreme cases in social media of many people behaving in conventionally racist ways. We're just going to say it's the structure, but we're not going to define that because we don't know exactly how to. So that's kind of where I land right now, and I've been trying to think really hard because I'm trying to give this argument of structural racism the benefit of the doubt, and I'm just not seeing a convincing argument for it in the way that, let's say, it's laid out in a lot of like critical theory, for instance. Let's say. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just leave it there for a second to let you talk.
I think structural racism, institutional racism, systemic racism, and I would say there is a significant difference between institutional racism and then um, systemic racism. And that institutional racism specifically talks about there are rules and laws that are still, I think relatively explicitly racist. I don't think we have that. That comes up. That things are struck down by the courts because it's obvious that they have racist intent. Um, but I would say that's pretty. Those are small and somewhat few and far between when you look at where we were before the civil rights movement. Um, I think government has really cleaned house, and I'll give them a lot of government a lot of credit for that. I think where this idea, unfortunately, it's become somewhat of a lightning rod. This whole idea of structural racism and systemic racism, which are more synonyms for each other, um, because it's easy to throw around and not really back up, and it's become a buzzword without allowing a lot of critical thinking. And for me, my initial thought is an inanimate thing cannot be racist. It's people that make it racist. Um, and it's the same thing with policy, because when we talk about structure, and I'm talking about government, the private sector is a different area. And I think that's kind of warrants this maybe a different kind of discussion or a different kind of treatment. I don't know what that would be, but it is different. I'm talking about policy now, though. Um, Policy is created and can be canceled by or changed by people. And I think what the challenge is that when government really cleaned house, and that terminology I used during the civil rights movement really cleaned up the laws and got rid of those ones that were obviously extremely racist. We were left with we were left with what we were at in 1960 and 1970, and it hasn't changed a whole lot. And I think we didn't the first time through we didn't do a very good job, we as in government, in really understanding the depth of which some of those policies ran and the impacts they have. And I'll use child welfare, for example. That's actually an earlier case. That's in the 1990s. That's actually slightly different. But I'll use it as an example anyway because it's interesting. There was this whole thing in the 1990s around deadbeat dads. And deadbeat dads were black. This was in the Clinton and Clinton years. There wasn't white deadbeat dads, there were black deadbeat dads. I mean, the black deadbeat dad was kind of the poster child for that.
Mm-hmm.
There were white deadbeat dads, absolutely. What is a deadbeat dad? Dads who didn't support their kids. And so, in the 1990s, building off of some of the punitive laws that were already in place, government decided, this is under the Clinton years, I do believe, if not a little bit before, that we were going to have extremely harsh punishments for deadbeat dads. We are going to fine them up with the wazoo. If they can't pay, they get thrown in jail, etc. Very, very, very harsh. And the concept, sure, I mean, hypothetically, it makes sense. We'll come down to this group of people using some of the existing laws that we have as templates that were also kind of pre civil rights time, and craft this new series of legislation that really hurts, really punishes people so they can change their behavior. And the unfortunate result of that was mass incarceration of black men. And so no, the system is not racist, but the policymakers had good intent, but we don't seem to have the clairvoyance to understand what is the impact of this in 10, 20, 30, 40 years on essentially on the
Hmm.
wealth accumulation of African Americans. Um, and it has a obviously a very, very big impact. And so, no, I don't think an inanimate thing can be racist. But we continue to develop policies that have impacts on minorities disproportionately. I don't think it's not because of racist intent. I mean, that's why I really have a problem with racism as the word.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like dumb.
So,
like
so I completely agree with you. I think it's almost like the term racism, with how emotionally charged it is, across the political spectrum, is getting in the way of the problems that are trying to be solved. Because if you look at that Clinton era policy that you just mentioned, um, nothing in that policy explicitly targeted black men, yet it disproportionately affected black men, right? Like, it's not explicitly saying we're going to crack down on deadbeat dads who are black.
no, nothing like that set. No, there's no policy in the US that says something like that anymore.
Exactly. And yet it still disproportionately affects that population.
90 to 1,
It,
95 to 5%.
exactly. And so I think a lot of well-meaning, educated types reference examples like that as an example of structural racism, right? They see it as yes, maybe you're not explicitly talking about one group or another, but given the current status quo of how different racial groups are kind of organized along the economic hierarchy, certain policies do happen to disproportionately affect certain minority groups, right? And that's a very legitimate argument. It's just that I don't think that using the term structural racism is a productive way to frame the conversation. Instead, there's a more productive way of framing that conversation where you can talk about, like, talk about that specific issue, right? Maybe that specific issue is the wealth gap, right? There's a 10-to-1 wealth gap between black households and white households, right? I want to talk about that, but let's table that for right now as I try to make this point. There's an education gap, right, between white households and black households. There is an income gap. We can talk about those issues in a way that doesn't necessarily have to put race at the highlight, because at the end of the day, if we were to reframe that as let's say low income neighborhoods are missing these certain advantages, right? Then we can both get rid of the politically charged aspect, and we can also kind of eliminate the fallacy that I think a lot of people jump to when they hear the idea of structural racism and interpret it incorrectly. That there are people who are so racist, who are permeated throughout the system, and unfortunately, I think too many people believe this, who are just kind of using their racism to stop people from having opportunity at every step of the way. And I don't think that's correct. And maybe it's my privilege speaking, but I don't think that's an accurate way of perceiving the world. And when you talk about structural racism, when really what you mean is a complex myriad of economic and socio political and cultural dynamics that perpetuate inequalities, like you're allowing people to have that perspective. Like it's this, and again, I'm sorry to keep using these religion analogies, but it's the same thing as like when someone who's an intellectual and who's technically an atheist, but who has religious leanings, uses the term God in the same way that a religious fanatic does, and that person allows for the fanatic to maintain their set of beliefs around a literal God and listen to this intellectual as they talk about God in a figurative way and justify their literal interpretation, right? It's the same thing that happens when people talk about structural racism in such a way that doesn't differentiate between just complex structural socioeconomic effects and like literal, there are a bunch of racists in the world preventing people, and allows people to have that more fanatic belief to perpetuate their ideas. Does that make sense? I think I've jumped way too far, but
Well, just a couple, yeah, I think it does make sense. Just a couple of things to build on that. The terminology is used as somewhat of a dog whistle, I think. And I see that, and I think it's very interesting because Biden, mentioned it a couple of times in his acceptance speech. And I know, I mean, I know partly not because I know Biden at all, but because I am an institutionalist, a budding one. I love the institution, and Biden is also that. And I think that when he says that, what he thinks of is exactly what you defined, Steve, as a complex interaction among various systems that produces adverse impacts unintentionally. But what his primary voters hear is tear the system down.
because it is irredeemably racist, and by irredeemably racist, they mean there is no hope as a, let's say, a black man to ever see any kind of success because the entire system of white people is trying to bring you down deliberately,
Right.
explicitly.
So I think, and I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing is using that term, but I think it's a dog whistle. I think he understands it in a very different way. And I think probably Obama understood it in a very different way. He was also an institutionalist. Then the Democratic primary voters want to understand it. It's very similar to the kind of the discussion we were having earlier about primary voters in this hypothetical situation in Atlanta, where you I just hypothet you could use things like I'm just going to use this, and I'm not saying this is right. I think it's a heuristic in this case. We're going to keep this runoff system in place, and the primary voters like, yeah, because for them it's like, yeah, the racist primary voters like, yeah, but he's like, well, never have like any kind of liberal black person run this state. Where I think it's somewhat, and I'm not saying it's all of them, of course, but a subset, a very small subset. But I think there's also a very small subset of the Democratic Party when you use the term institutional racism, like, yeah, it means he's gonna burn the whole thing down, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
that's not the case. The other thing I'd say on this is it's also I see it as somewhat of a it's a shorthand. I think it's a shorthand to talk about things, and I think that's probably a positive way to frame the term dog whistle. Is that if you want to talk about this massive system of inequalities that have kind of perpetuated through time, it's easy just to call it racist. I don't personally, I don't think this institution can be racist, but that's the easy way to term it as. However, I think that
Mm-hmm.
also leads to kind of interesting policy decisions, and I'll use this as an example. So, um, where I live, the university nationally developed this fantastic research program, in my opinion, fantastic research program looking at the history of redlining. So they actually go back and look at old plat maps and
Mm-hmm.
map like racial covenants and redlining on the block by block basis. And actually, properties like individual parcels would have covenants attached to them, like
Mm.
and which is really interesting. I mean, it's like a fascinating historical research project, like really important to understand that history. I think what has happened now is people have said, okay, well, now let's create a whole. Not, I think what has happened, but what has happened is the city has created a whole program wherein you can go and have the racial covenant, taken off. You can look up your property, have the racial covenant taken off of it through a legal process if you want to do that. And I'm like, that's great, but that is so fucking symbolic. Like it means absolutely nothing. But at the same time, you look at racial covenants and you understand that throughout time by really prohibiting, and this is more redlining, by prohibiting investment in certain areas of the city, you have perpetuated a housing stock that is extremely unhealthy for people to live in. And actually, the housing stock itself, and this is really fascinating research, it actually perpetuates very poor health outcomes for individuals.
So it's not just a wealth
It's not
issue.
wealth, it's health as well. It's wealth
Mm.
and health. And there are some very obvious policy solutions to that. One of those solutions is not developing a system where guilty white people can go have the racial covenant taken off their property. And it's just like your virtue signal. I mean, I get it's a cool project. If you had all the money in the world, sure, spend it on that project. That's cool. Whatever. Like I'd probably have mine taken off if there was one
Well,
on my property.
let me ask
But
this to try to like I agree with you. I agree with you, but here's a question to try to bolster that the other side. Where is that money going to? Because if the money that people are paying to take off that racial covenant is going to social causes that are kind of buffeting the or trying to reduce the disparity, maybe there's a benefit
oh,
there.
I'm sorry that so it's free to do, but what I'm saying is that the amount of money the city would have invested in this endeavor, right? Because
Oh,
you
okay.
have to create a whole dashboard. You can like look it up and like tie it to the university data, and then you have to get a lawyer to rewrite your your deed. I mean, that's not
Yep.
cheap shit. Like that's millions and millions of dollars over time. And I'm like, you're doing all that where you could be repairing or like replacing lead pipes in these neighborhoods that were redlined. It's still have lead pipes. You could be taking out lead paint. You could be.
No, and this is great because I think it kind of lends to a kind of higher level point that I want to make before I forget it, which is that there's something fundamentally destructive of about the idea of like virtue signaling through the rhetoric of structural racism in a way that allows you to omit yourself from looking at the hard facts on the ground, right? And so again, I'm sorry if I'm jumping too much here,
Can I jump
but
it just really
yeah, go
quick?
ahead, go ahead.
I think I want to really focus this hard facts on the ground thing because I think that really
Yep.
matters. It might be where you're going. Is that
Yes, 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 yes.
I work in government. I talk about that a lot, but I am really proud of it. And I'm proud of the people I work with. And the fact is, and this is a hard fact for people to swallow, is that, you know, homey old ladies in crappy sweaters they bought at Walmart are running this system. And these people are honest, they have good intentions, they want to do the best thing possible. What's That's the system. The system is a bunch of like middle-aged women, like in shitty clothes. Like
This is interesting. Okay.
that is the system. And that is a fact. I mean, I am generalizing just as you did, but there are a lot of people who just kind of middle class. They just want to come to work and they want to help people. That's the system you're talking about. There's not some oogie boogie evil man up there. And the challenge is the leadership of these counties, which are definitely highly qualified, and I would count myself in the leadership level, are qualified, intelligent, really well intentioned, but very pragmatic people, are saying, we see the disparate outcomes that our policies are causing. We see that we can't change anything because if we try to change this law or this statute or that statute or this fee or that fee, either we blow a hole in our budget and can't deliver services. We The legal costs associated with like going all the way, not the legal costs, but like the lobbyist costs of going all the way to the state legislature to get something changed, that's impossible. The political climate, or like there's a split on the board where some are hard on crime, some are soft on crime, and they like to play to those demographics and those primary voters. They don't want to budge on maybe a more lenient adjustment to uh, child payments by fathers. That's the reality. That is the system. It's messy and it's not perfect, and that's the fact though. And like you blow that up, you're not blowing anything up if you blow that up. Like that's what we have designed, and it's really, 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 really hard to make change happen by design.
It sounds like what you're saying is that the reality is that on the ground there are a bunch of people who have built a system over time that's incredibly complicated to deal with an incredibly complicated society, and that there are regular people filling the roles of decision making across the chain there, and that there isn't some kind of like top down racist intent that is somehow uh, coercing our system to discriminate against certain people.
That's exactly what I'm saying, and that I think is what is really hard for liberals to understand, for anyone. I'm not saying liberals, anyone to understand. And I think where people get really frustrated is like, why aren't you changing this stuff faster? And that's why. I mean, it is so complex. It's like a balloon. You squeeze one end here and it blows up over here. You squeeze this and it blows up over here. And then like if you find the balance, the politicians come in and say, actually, we don't want a balloon. We want a giraffe. And you're like, okay, changing tact now. you
Yeah.
know?
Oh man, and that's a fascinating conversation. I'd love to have with you around like that dynamic between politicians and,
and the civil
let's say,
service.
civil servants. But let's hold that for
That's
another
different, no, different
another
topic.
another podcast another day. But I think hearing what you're saying, there's one argument that I could hear, to kind of steelman this institutional racism concept. That I could hear from people on the left, which is the idea of institutional bias. And it's like, okay, you mentioned at one point that across the chain, a lot of what you see is like middle-aged white women in sweaters, right? Which was just like a funny comment, but let's say that it's middle-aged white women from the suburbs in sweaters who are making a lot of these decisions, and hey, maybe the implicit bias that those people have is subtly impacting their behavior such that it nudges the needle ever so slightly or ever so extremely toward discriminating against minority groups because of their kind of in-group bias. And do you know how implicit bias training works? I'm guessing you do, right? So usually what you have is and I've sat through a couple of these. I'm sure Scott's sat through a lot more. You would say press a button for positive and press a button for negative, and then you can say to the person, okay, press the positive button every time you see a white person, press the negative button every time you see a black person, and then you can flip those two. And what you notice is that the reaction time for most employees, both black and white and all other groups, is slightly slower to get the right response when you have, say, black people mapped to positive. And the assumption here is that our society is so ingrained with the notion of kind of racist intent that everybody sees an implicit bias to see black people as worse than white people. The problem with this is that many studies have been done around the idea of whether this slight reaction time bias actually leads to tangible outcomes in people's behavior, and there have not, no one's ever seen any tangible behavioral difference. The other thing I'll say, and this is pretty obvious, but I think people are surprised when they hear this, is there's a reason why these tests are done on the order of milliseconds, not seconds, let's say. It doesn't take a few seconds for someone to remap the idea of a black guy being good, right? The reason it's done on the order of milliseconds is because it's such a small difference that you have to look at such a small time frame to actually notice anything reasonable. And so I'm not saying that there's absolutely no data around the notion of implicit bias, but there is no data around whatever is causing the minor millisecond difference to have any kind of ballooning effect toward having notable differences within our society, let's say.
There's been also this. You're probably familiar with this. Actually, it's multiple studies because it's been replicated. The resume study with different
Mm-hmm.
names,
Yeah,
um,
I have heard about that.
where it is the resume with the. Well, I want to back up before I go into that. On a conceptual level, I think there might be something here, and I say that because I've actually who was it? I think it was. I have to look at the study, but who did it? But there was a really amazing study done by an Ivy League, and I don't know which one, that looked at um, uh, it was longitudinal data of like the data point, the data was what made it amazing was the amount of data they had. It was just phenomenal amount of data. It was like millions of Americans, and they were trying to find predictors for something. I don't know what it was. They were trying to find the predictor for some socioeconomic outcome. I can't remember what it was. Um, they threw every fucking variable they could think of into the bucket. Of course, race was one of them. They threw every single variable into the bucket that they could absolutely think of. And race, still came up as a small but significant explainer. And now this is multivariate regression. There's issues with multivariate regression. But I've heard other studies of this ilk as well. And I know academics can be biased, but the academics I know and associate with and understand, they want the truth. Like if the truth is inconvenient, they still are interested in it. And so studies like that, I do pay a little bit of attention to. So what it says to me is like, yeah, there's a billion explanatory variables, but race seems to still play some role. Either it plays a role. I mean, there's two explanations, right? I guess three. One, it plays some role to some level of coefficient. Um, we're missing a variable that varies with race that needs to be plugged in instead of race that explains it. But we don't know what that variable is because we've thrown everything in. Or all of the regressions are wrong, but I don't think that's right. I think there's something there. There's a variable or variables or the race still plays on it. And so what I think of, and conceptually, this makes sense to me because I know the resume study where individuals who are reviewing resumes will pick the resumes to a statistically significant degree of names that sound Western, right? White type names. Um, and that's been replicated. It's been shown to be statistically significant. So I say, okay, well, what if? And I guess I'm kind of going on what you just said, Steve. What if there is? And I have a caveat to throw in here though. What if these very minute decisions by maybe one out of every 50 people, one out of every 100 people make this decision in a way that they wouldn't have if they had been completely, which is irrational, to be completely not quote unquote racist or not want to go with your in group, right? I mean, like it's you can't ever achieve that. And maybe that in some way is tilting the system. And remind you, we're talking of 5,000 counties and 50 states and a federal government and millions of hundreds of thousands, I should say, of sub government agencies shifting that through those multitudes of small individual level choices. That to me, like conceptually, makes sense. Yeah, yes, that happens. I mean, that could happen. Um, but then for me, I know our social workers where I work. I've I've met them, and they are the most because where I'm going with this is that those individual level decisions are about individuals are made at a very specific level in government. So imagine government as well, just imagine it as kind of a skyscraper, all right? And the part of government that actually interacts with residents is the first floor of the skyscraper, right? And say it's a 50-story skyscraper. The leadership is the 50th story. And everything in between is systems support to run this extremely complicated organization. Now, when you're divorced from level one, you have a lot more time. You don't have milliseconds, you have hours, days to make decisions. And you're able to think through these decisions and say, okay, immediately my reaction was maybe that wasn't a great reaction, but I have a whole day to think about this. I'm going to think about, okay, what would be the best decision for our residents and what would help the people who really need it.
And so if there was implicit bias, it would be happening at the first level.
First floor. Now, the thing is, I've met our first floor people. And they are the most, and I'm sure there's bad ones. I've heard about bad ones. But the ones I've met are just saints. I mean, I can 100% say that. Like, they are the most caring, compassionate people. they work with predominantly minorities. I mean, people receiving services are predominantly minorities, so
Mm-hmm.
they're endlessly compassionate, but they also are a quick aside, they're also really hard asses because sometimes it's just like you have to lay down the law. It's like, no, you're not smoking in the office. No, I mean, like something get really they like
Yeah,
switch from angelic to like boss boss mode. But these
but
people
you need
are,
that.
but you need that, are just extraordinary. And it's really hard for me to understand. And I can, let's say I'll just call him by his first letter, J. There's a guy I worked with, J. That's the first letter of his name. I can't imagine how he would have, how he would have an iota of animosity towards any of race in my wildest dreams. Maybe I don't know about these people, but like this is the first floor. That's where those split seconds decisions are made. Split second decisions are the decisions where you have the most uh, ready environment for racism to occur.
And I think this is really good insight that myself as well as most listeners wouldn't have in the inner workings of how the government works and a good way of conceptualizing it. And I think one of the good takeaways here is that like it's not that it's non existent, but it's most likely really rare that you have blatant racists who are interfacing with the public, and that higher up the chain, um, given we don't have a society full of hidden closet racists, which I don't think we have, people have enough time to remedy the notion of implicit bias. But I think that at the end of the day, all of the conversation we've been having kind of comes back to a larger question here, right? So we've both been saying that the notion of structural racism is problematic in various ways. That systems are really complex, and that inequalities between racial groups do manifest themselves within our society, but that they're not necessarily tied to, let's say, racist policies or racist people, right? At a macro level, right? That's not discounting the notion of like there being actual racists of all racial groups. I think that is the case. You can't avoid that. Let's have that conversation later, right? But what I want to get to is there's a reality that exists where there are different attainment outcomes between different racial groups, and we are arguing that structural racism is not the reason that exists. And so I think this is the part of the conversation that's incredibly emotionally charged. And this is the part of the conversation I want to turn to now around what is causing those differences, if not structural racism. Do you have thoughts?
Well, I would just is that hmm. Well, first I want to say, and this is not related to your question, but it is somewhat related. I do think that racism plays some degree in outcome. I think the it has two significant caveats though. The first being geographic location, and the second being the size. And sorry, I always talk in terms of regression. The size of the coefficient. What I mean when I say the size of the coefficient, I mean is that a 0.0001 in front of it, or is that a 10 times in front of it? And I think it's more in the 0.00001s. And not that small, but I think it's
Yeah,
small.
but I guess my point is that um, racism, at least in the way that we've perceived its impact, is insufficient to explain the economic and wealth disparities that we see between racial groups in our society today, right? Like if you think about it, the wealth gap. I mentioned this earlier. I think now is the time to get into it between black households and white households in America is 10-1, right? And why is that? If it's not structural racism, what is causing that disparity?
Well, just to be a little flippant, I would say racism, but I would say racism a long time ago.
Historical racism.
I
Yeah, and that's a great point, because we live in a historical context, right? We live as the ancestors of people who lived in a past that was racist. So in the post World War II era, there was an explicit policy initiative to create a middle class, which wasn't really a thing before the end of World War II, right? And that was done through explicit government intervention, through loans that allowed for families to get houses on the cheap, and when they get those houses, they have the opportunity now to finance future houses on those previous houses. So let's say your family, you come back from the war, you buy a house. Now you can give that house to your children as you get your second house, and now your children have the opportunity to use to have some financial freedom, and they can explore opportunities to increase wealth, and over time that leads to massive wealth expansion. In that's no oversimplification, because it's looking at one dynamic, which is specifically housing policy, but that allowed for the middle class to expand. And let's talk specifically about housing policy with redlining initiatives. Those initiatives, which were explicitly meant to bolster the development of a middle class, were only allowed for specific subsets of the population, and specifically excluded black people. And so I think it's very reasonable to say that some of the impact of this disparity that we see is because there were racist policies in the past, like redlining, for instance, that we're still seeing the effects of now. I will push back, though, and say that I don't think that fully accounts for the discrepancy that we see today. But I think that you have to account for that as a part. And again, this comes back to what Scott was saying earlier, where when you look at livelihoods and realities on the ground, things are really complicated. It's a multivariate analysis. You have to take all of these different points of fact into account, right? This is going to be an incredibly controversial position to take, and I think it's much less appropriate for me to be making this point. So I will recommend listeners to listen to a very intelligent young man by the name of Coleman Hughes, who I started listening to very recently, and he's I think he's either a recent college graduate or a undergrad. He's a senior in undergrad. He's very young, in New York. I don't remember if it was like Columbia or NYU or something, but he has some very intelligent ideas on this, and as a black man, I think he's much more like you should listen to what he says, because me saying it doesn't hold as much weight, right? So I'm just going to caveat with saying that. But one of the things that he talks about as a really important concept to understand is that the history of Black America has resulted in the manifestation of a culture that itself leads to the perpetuation of a wealth and income disparity. And I think that if you can agree with that, which itself is a contentious issue, then you have to recognize, right? Like, I'm going to start at the high level, then go into the lower level of like why the argument makes sense. I'm going to start with if you believe the argument, why it matters, and then I'm going to dive into what the argument is, right? So if you agree with that argument, the reason it matters is that, as uncomfortable as it sounds to hear that argument, If you genuinely want for all people in our society to have equal opportunity and to have the capacity to live fulfilling lives, you have to understand that no matter how uncomfortable those facts are, that it is your moral imperative to get to the bottom of them and figure out how you can support a more fulfilling future, right? You can't shy away from actual facts that, if you were to address, can support your ideal future just because those facts are uncomfortable to hear, right? And I think that's a really important point. And it's and I'll say one more thing about that. It's a level of cowardice to shy away from them, right? It's cowardice to shy away from facts that make you uncomfortable if those facts could lead to the future you want. So that's the point I'll make about that. But let's dive into why that argument actually makes sense. I'm gonna need a new drink soon. I'm getting really fucking drunk. I'm sorry, but so why Coleman's argument makes sense. If you look at the behavioral differences between black Americans and white Americans when it comes to education in, let's say, middle school and high school, specifically around men. And again, it's a generalization, but I've heard anecdotes about this. Obama actually talked about this specifically. Jay-Z talked about this. Coleman Hughes talks about this specifically and mentions both of those prominent black figures, where oftentimes in black communities, if you perform well, particularly in a mixed race high school, you're seen as performing white. And that's incredibly problematic because if you have lower grades in high school, regardless of your race, that projects into to lower level college. What's the word? Admission, and that leads to less high paying job occupational attainment. And so, if you have a culture that vilifies the idea of proper education, then that exactly is a systemic issue that will prevent a certain subset, in this case a racial subset, the black community, from being able to perform at the level of other communities. Because at a cultural level, it's vilified to be seeking the same level of educational attainment. So there was another example of this I wanted to give, which is that if you look at polls about how people spend their money, it is often the case that at equivalent income levels, black families, black women in particular, oh man, I'm going to get so much shit for this, tend to spend more money on luxury flamboyant goods than do white women. And so at the household level, things like cars. At the individual, like female level, let's say, things like jewelry. For the income level, black women spend and black families spend disproportionately higher on consumer goods that are not investments, where white families spend much more on investments. That can be attributed to a cultural difference in terms of how people view the way they should spend their money, right? And so the kind of long-winded thing I'm trying to come to here is that we have to be able to talk about these really uncomfortable ideas around cultural differences, because they do have a tangible impact. I'm not saying that they are the only impact, right? Because we've already talked about other things here. But when we're looking at a complex multivariate problem for why we have these racial discrepancies, we have to factor this in, because the data obviously shows there are these discrepancies, and you'd have to be blind to assume that they don't have an impact on the outcome.
This is a theory that was actually started. If anyone really wants to understand the origin of this theory, it's called the culture of poverty. And read Oscar Lewis, who is the anthropologist who published this in 1969. So these aren't new ideas. These are regurgitations of a very old idea. that really gained traction in the time when punitive law was really coming to the forefront. Um, and it's a very interesting argument. Steve highlighted a lot of it. I mean, it sounds like whatever that podcaster is sort of that's the argument, is this Oscar Lewis culture of poverty argument. Um, I'm going to actually read you a quote from his book. So the subculture of the poor develops mechanisms that tend to perpetuate it, especially because of what happens to the worldview, aspirations, and character of the children who grow up in it. So I've read this book by Oscar Lewis. It's a fascinating book, and Oscar Lewis is a fascinating and very intelligent man. And I think there's a lot to be learned from it. I think I'm not going to disagree with all of it. I think the question for me is, why is there this culture? Because I don't think it's a black culture. I think it's a culture of poverty. I think he nailed it when he said culture of poverty, not a culture of black, culture of poverty.
I completely agree with that, by the way. I'm not saying that this is
Yeah,
inherent in the kind of racially based biology of any subgroup. Like,
yeah,
I'm not saying
yeah,
that at all.
yeah.
And do you have a theory on that? Because I do.
Well, I think, frankly, I somewhat agree with Lewis. Is that if you don't see an opportunity to succeed, if you don't see a path, if you don't have examples, and that's why black fathers and black mothers are so important and such big, and why there's so many nonprofits to support black fathers, is that if you don't see a role model, you're not going to do very well, regardless of what culture you're from. If you don't have a role model, you're going to end up like crap. And so if you have a bad role model and you don't see other people who look like you succeeding, why would you want to? I mean, some people, of course, you'll have breakouts. You're like, I want to break out, but that's not everybody. That's not most people. You know, it's it's depressing. You're growing up in a house that has toxic mold in it. You have lead poisoning. You're going to a crappy school with a bunch of people who look like you are also not succeeding, who have similar lifestyles. There's gangs, there's shootings. I mean, I look at North Minneapolis. We've had more shootings this year than we've had in any year in modern history, and just North Minneapolis.
Yet
It's
we have people talking about defunding the police.
That's a different story.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's not talk. They don't live in North Minneapolis. Um, Growing up in that's extreme. It's about, I think. So you asked me. I think it's really about childhood psychology. It's about developmental psychology. You know, that's we are shaped by our childhoods. We are who we are because of our childhoods. And I think if you're growing up in a situation like that, it does not bode well for you. Um,
I completely agree. And one really interesting argument I've heard about this is that the way police, again, I am coming back to police, are distributed, it is actually pretty racially unequal, but not in the ways that a lot of the current kind of like BLM rhetoric is talking about it, especially through like 70s, 80s, 90s, and onward. There was and you still see it in statistics today, where there's significantly less effort placed on reducing, let's say, homicide in black communities specifically. And this can actually be traced back to eugenics movements, where there would be a deliberate reduction of police forces in black communities because eugenics itself, like pre-World War II, was seen as a pretty conventional, well accepted philosophy, and so there was an implicit assumption of black people being worse in terms of procreation, and therefore the obvious way to get rid of them was to have them fight it out amongst themselves. And so when you had a white community, there would be violent crime, you'd have police crackdowns. And in a black community, when you have violent crime, the police wouldn't engage. And over time, when you hear that, you see inklings of that today. Like where in a lot of black communities, police intervention tends to be for nonviolent drug offenses, and there's disproportionately less for violent crime compared to in other areas of the city, right? There's always more police touch points because there's more violent crime in certain black neighborhoods. Like, we can get into that later, but there's significantly less relative to the rate of homicide. And so what happens in an environment where there isn't a strict police force is that populations tend to revert to the mean. And the mean is that you have men who compete for status via violence. And so there's an honor culture that kind of builds up, and you naturally get gang communities form, and you have massively high rates of homicide. People are talking about so much about police violence, but for every 10 people killed in low-income communities, 9 of them are homicides, not based on police violence, and one is maybe a cop, right? Justified or unjustified. And so it's not that black communities are particularly violent because they're black. It's that there's a historical system of police neglect, and a system that has led people to think that when someone murders another person, there's no system of law that's going to right that wrong. And as a young man in that chaotic environment, you have to take up arms, and you have to, put your honor on the line and make something happen. And this police neglect, I'm not saying it's the entire issue, but it's more of an issue than people give it credit, because there are communities in America where the police have just neglected the responsibility of taking on violent criminals and establishing order. And because of it, the young men and women, but mostly men, growing up in that society have to do it themselves, and it gets really messy. And so when I hear this argument about defunding the police, it actually makes me really angry, because it's like they don't understand the reality. They don't understand that it was police neglect itself, right? Failure to establish a stable framework on which you can build an established society that's led to a homicide rate that is so obscenely high in these certain populations. And it's fucking tragic. It really is. It's tragic. And yet you have all these people who think they're virtue signaling the right way to say defund the police, and they fail to recognize that for every person killed by the police, there were so many more people killed because the police failed to do their job. And I don't know. I had a whole thing because I did some research on the police killing BLM movement thing, and I want to touch on that before we go. But if you have comments about what I said earlier, let's do that first, and then I do want to get a drink.
Well, we started that question with why have we wound up at this point, and what are the reasons behind it? And we started talking about the culture of poverty. Started by the mention of the podcast, and then going to the culture of poverty. And I think what is mentioned by that podcaster and the idea of culture of poverty is it's an outcome. It's not a cause. It's a result of something. Yep. It arises because of something. Whether or not, the culture of poverty, I think, it's a lightning rod term, and it was developed as such. It was meant to be that, to get people thinking. But I think there's something there. And we've talked about that. But I think there's other aspects as well. And I just want to mention really quickly two things. And one is return on capital. It's as simple as that. We live in a capitalist country. And if you're able to invest earlier on, you get a larger return later on. And so we talk about how these are perpetuated, and it's simply because people who have more money get more money later on, and you have inheritance. I mean, I'll have an inheritance from my parents. I mean, that's really, really big. And we can't ignore that. That's just a very, very plain and simple fact. And the other one is poll taxes. And poll taxes, despite what a lot of people think, they think like people had to pay to go to the polls. That's not what poll taxes mean. Poll taxes means like a tax levied on anyone irrespective of their income. It's the same tax for everyone, a flat tax. And the idea of poll taxes started in the South as a way to really to penalize disfranchised African Americans. And poll taxes have turned into a fees and fines regiment. And government lives. Their margins are almost made up by fees and fines now. And that's somewhat based on the history of the poll tax, is that irrespective of your ability to pay, we're going to fine you this amount for this thing that you do.
Hmm.
Um, and that so it's kind of two sides of the same coin. One, you have lack of income through no appreciation in value because you don't start with a lot of value through the capitalist system. And two, you're charged the same amount for something that someone who has 10 times your income is charged. um, Library fees, which where I worked, finally we got rid of library fees because we're like, why are we charging someone who makes 20,000 a year $10 for a late book, and then charging someone who makes $200,000 a year $10 for a late book? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you understand the role of government as not leveling the playing field, but like try not to make more harm than good. All right. Um,
Or let's say trying to treat each citizen equally.
Try and treat them equally and like meet them where they're at, right? And I'm not
Yeah.
talking about charging a $10,000 fee to someone who makes $200,000 and a $10. No, I'm talking about like, let's just get rid of the damn fees and let's try to find another source of income. And I think fees, while we think of a $5 and $10 and $15 here and there as nothing, me and you, there's a lot of research showing, and especially where I work, we've done research that shows there's a significant percentage of people who cannot afford a $10 fee, which is heartbreaking. You don't have $10 to spend. And here it is, a government that is trying to be looking out for you to provide you a safety net when you need it, charging you something that you can't owe, and taking away the rights. And I'm using the library in this case. There's a million examples of fines and fees, and then taking the rights away of knowledge. Where you, okay, if you can't pay us, you don't get access to knowledge that might help advance you in your career goals. You know, that's really, really, really sad. And that is also another reason why. And you can call that structural racism. Again, it's not racist. It's just kind of been built in, and now the problem is we now rely on those fees and fines. It's like that makes up part of our budget.
So
So
Scott, I want
yeah,
to I want to say a point here, and that's that like I empathize with what you're saying, and I agree with everything that you're saying, but again, and I think you agree with this, like none of that sounds like a racism issue,
oh, I wasn't even talking about that at this point. It's
right?
just yeah,
And
yeah. Yeah.
and the point I'm trying to make by that is that, and again, I think that we're not the norm here on the left, right? As people who do ascribe to being on the left, um, and maybe I'm the one who's misinformed, but I think that most people will not take the same perspective of the structural issues that we talk about. Yeah, there are structural issues around, say, referencing what you were talking about with lack of exposure to education. But it's not like there's an explicitly racial bend to it.
I see white homeless people in the library, and I see black homeless people in the more black,
Exactly.
but
Um,
everyone.
and if you don't mind, and I know this is a tangent, I'd like to kind of give an analogy to, because, and I know it's not the most fun thing to do to overly criticize the woke left, but I see a lot of this pervading into kind of standard notions of intellectualism, and I recently got into a debate with a friend where it felt like this was starting to pervade. So I'm feeling this ever present. But this idea of kind of structural racism in the conventional sense, I know we already talked about it, but Spawn give this analogy, and it's not an analogy that I came up with. It's an analogy by this guy James Lindsay, who worked with a couple other academics to release some bogus academic articles in postmodern and critical theory disciplines, and he actually got them he got them accepted into certain journals, and they were all bogus. And one of them was literally a word for word reconstruction of Mein Kampf, except that he switched the word Jews with white men, and it got rejected only because it wasn't extreme enough and it wasn't critical enough of white men.
What
Hilarious.
journals even?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. That's a whole other conversation. But he had an analogy of that kind of went like this, right? Imagine that you're walking down the street and you're walking with your wife or your girlfriend, and there's a bottle on the street, and you trip on the bottle. You end up pushing your wife, and she ends up falling into the street right when a car kind of whizzes by, hits her, and she dies. Right? There are a lot of ways to think about who is to blame for this issue. Right? The obvious one is that the driver is to blame.
No, the obvious answer is no one's to blame. It's an act of God.
You're right, but let's get to that, right? So
come on, how much logic does it take?
Yeah, like you could blame the driver. You could also blame yourself for tripping over the bottle. But maybe what you can do is say the fact that the bottle was there was out of your control. So why was the bottle there? Well, the bottle was there because we have a society which promotes and normalizes, let's say, the idea of drinking and normalizes the idea of littering, such that it becomes acceptable within our society to drink beer and toss the bottle. Maybe we can also say that we have a society that is structured. It is structurally driver-centric in such a way that we have roads that cordon off where pedestrians can even walk. So you have a dualistic competing system of faults between a driver-oriented society and an alcohol enforcing culture. And the coupling of those things leads to a systemic oppression of sober pedestrians. I don't think these were the exact terms he's using, and I'm overly kind of like expanding on this analogy. But you could say that is the systemic oppression against sober pedestrians is what killed your wife or girlfriend.
Was the analogy made to sound stupid, or like was this legitimate? Because that's
no.
Really
so this is
analogy.
This was made to be
silly. Was it made to be silly?
Silly, yeah.
Silly.
And compete against compete against the notion of structural racism. And so, again, I think if you're someone who's a hardcore believer in the notion of structural racism, you'll find this incredibly offensive.
I also think analogies and parables describing something as complex as structural as racism or the lack thereof is somewhat inappropriate. I'm not talking about you, Steve, but just like generally, like.
See, I'm gonna push back on this specific example because I think this specific example is exactly appropriate. Because I think it's doing the same thing, not in terms of the emotions that are laden with the issues, but in terms of the logical leaps that are made. I don't see where there's something logical missing in terms of the way this narrative is produced and the structural racism narrative is produced. So, I mean, I'm
being critical.
Happy to hear your argument against it. If you're willing to argue against,
I don't have an argument against it because
discrepancy is.
I know I don't have an argument against it. I'm just trying to. I'm at the. Wait, what exactly did you say against stage?
I'm not sure.
No, I'm like, what? No, the analogies didn't make sense to me. But I think I understand the intent of what you're trying to say by saying that analogy. And I think yeah, I don't know. I don't like
So
analogies.
at this point,
That
and
was
it's
a
way
really
too late.
bad
It's way too.
analogy.
I don't think it was a bad analogy, but I think there is an important point that I need to make here, which is kind of like a, I don't know if PSA is the right term, but I'm gonna say it's a PSA announcement, right? And I should have said this earlier on because anyone who needs to hear this will have already stopped listening to this podcast at this point, right?
Yeah.
But I do think it's important to say this. I think there's a tendency, and I really do think this is the case, right? I don't think I'm over generalizing here, but there's a tendency, especially on the left. It happens on the right too, but especially on the left, to couple the notion of having a certain perspective with having a certain like moral purity, sense of moral purity, let's say, and so there's a sense that when if you're on the left, and I say this because I'm speaking from my own perspective as someone who was on the far left before and who has gradually moved away toward a perspective that involves more critical thinking, let's say. That's again a rude way of saying it maybe, but there's a perspective on the left that couples the notion of the facts that you ascribe to and the moral virtues that are inherent within yourself. And so if you have certain beliefs, they make you morally pure, and if you have other beliefs, they make you morally impure. This becomes a problem because you can hear someone's argument and without having to engage with their facts, you can decide that they're morally impure and you can disregard them. And I feel this myself because in the past, some of the arguments I make today would have resulted in a visceral emotional response at a gut level for myself, right? And I think a lot of people have this, right? So I'll give it a really simple example of like, if you were to say structural racism is less of a problem of the discrepancies between race than the culture between those races. I think there are a lot of people who may or may not listen to this podcast who would feel a gut aversion to that very statement. And what I'm trying to say here is that aversion is not tied to the specific facts that I'm saying. It's tied to the moral mapping of that perspective to, your virtues. And so if you don't believe structural racism, systematic racism is the fundamental problem that leads to disparities between races, then you're a bad person, right? We need to get away from that. This is what I'm trying to say here. The big thing I'm trying to say here. We have to get away from moralizing facts. Because at the end of the day, the most constructive way to have very complex conversations about complex issues like this is to start by assuming that everybody wants a constructive outcome. And if it helps, start the conversation by laying out those outcomes, right? What I want, as we have this very complicated conversation, is to find a future in which everybody, regardless of race, can have opportunities that are equal to anyone else, and they can achieve the goals that they desire within reason, if they push hard enough for them, and that nobody should be prevented from that disproportionate to others based on characteristics about themselves that they cannot control, like race, right? And I think most people will agree with that as a goal, right? So if we can agree with that, let's try not to take someone's arguments and imbue them with our own subjective perspective of what their morality must be based on those arguments, and argue with that moral perspective, because that's not constructive. And I see this a lot happening on the left. So that's just kind of my like PSA that I wanted to say. I wanted to say earlier, and I don't think anyone will hear it since it's so late in the podcast, but I just wanted to say that.
It's good. And this might actually be somewhat of a good place to wrap up because I was I was listening to the acceptance speech by Biden a couple weeks ago, and I remembered Obama, and I kind of looked up some of his famous speeches, and I was really high at this time, and this is late at night. I was like, oh, I should not have started down this path. He has some good ones, but I think, and I'll get to where I was going in a second here. We may not all agree on the level of racism that's being played in this system. Some of us think it's significant, some of us don't think it's there at all. If we don't agree, is that a good point to start the conversation at? Or is it a better point to start the conversation at the outcome? Because I think we can all agree on that. We want everyone to have equal access, equal ability to achieve. And if we come from it from that standpoint, I think you can build a lot larger coalition and a lot larger support than if we dog whistle, and it has unfortunately become a dog whistle about race. And I want to quote it's a little bit on this point from Obama's keynote at the 2004 Democratic Convention. Do you remember who the president nominee was? Kerry, 16 years ago. So I'm going to read this, a couple minutes, but I think it's good. I think it wraps this up well. If there is a child on the south side of Chicago who can't read, that matters to me, even if it's not my child. If there's a senior citizen somewhere who can't pay for their drugs and has to choose between medicine and the rent, that makes my life poorer, even if it's not my grandparent. If there's an Arab American family being rounded up without benefit of an attorney or due process, that threatens my civil liberties. It is that fundamental belief. I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, that makes this country work. It's what allows us to pursue our individual dreams and yet still come together as one American family. Even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, the left and the right, that's my insert there, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a black America and there is not a white America. There is not a Latino America and there's not an Asian America. There is the United States of America. And he had the biggest applause at that point. And it was at that point, all the pundits after the speech said, this is going to be our next president. And it strikes me as both very sad and very hopeful, because later on he calls us, are we going to be cynics, or are we going to hope? And unfortunately went for the former choice, where everything needs to be blown up, nothing works. And unfortunately, I think part of his administration led to that as well. But going back to this point in 2004, 16 years ago, and reading some of that, it's like we're at the same spot today. And we're at the same spot with this.
We're at a worse spot.
In a worse spot than we were. And we're still at this point where race, which we thought was high tension in 2004 when Obama made this address, is still really high. And here we have the first black president of the United States saying there is no black America and there is no white America. He doesn't talk about racism once in this address. And here we are today. And I think we really missed what Obama was calling for in 2004. I think he probably missed his own lofty goals. But I think that still rings true. And I'd encourage anyone who's listening to this to go back and listen to that speech, because the rhetoric that he spells out in that, there was overtones of that in the Biden speech, which is not surprising being that he was the vice president. But it also reminds you how little progress we've made on this issue, and that I think we've made so little progress because it's become such a polarizing topic, and it should not be. Because we should be able to agree that we all want the good outcomes. Let's focus on the outcomes, not what we think is causing the outcomes, as right or wrong as we may be.
I would. I almost agree with you. I almost agree with you. I would just say your use of the term outcome triggered me a little bit because it reminded me a little bit too much about the equality of outcome camp. God, this is a terrible way to end it, isn't it?
Oh, you should have just shut up and let it go.
I
Damn
should
it.
have.
I
I
should have
should
just
have.
used a different word.
I think what you meant to say is that what Obama was striving for, what we should be striving for today, is an America where it doesn't matter the color of your skin. It doesn't matter where you're born, what family you're born to. You should have the same opportunity to pursue the American dream in the way that you see fit. And those barriers, while they have existed in the past based on whether it's the color of your skin or your gender or whatever it is, we are moving toward a future in which they don't exist. And we should all be hopeful about that future. We should all do our part to make sure that that's a collective goal that we can aspire to.
I want to go back. My favorite paragraph in that is the one I started out with, and it's if there is a child on the south side of Chicago who can't read, that matters to me. And I think what that says is what Steve and I are not saying is it's not based on some individual failing of people who
Or some
or
biological
some
failing.
biological failing. No, there is a structural, systematic failing at some point in this history that is causing this, and we should care about it. We should care about it, and I also think it's very important. The next line he says, and I don't want to go too gaga on Obama here, but I just really miss him after his presidency.
I do too.
If there is a senior citizen, and I'll put if there is a senior citizen, and I'll put this in because I think this is where he was thinking, in West Virginia, in Wyoming, in Montana, in Atlanta, who can't pay for their drugs, that has to choose between medicine and the rent, that makes my life poorer, even if it's not my grandparent. I think where he's going with that is if there's a conservative living in West Virginia who is struggling, that is also your problem. And you should care about that. And I think we've gotten to and we didn't talk about this a lot, where it's like we don't care if we care about the urban poor who have a specific skin color. We don't care about those in West Virginia. We don't care about the coal miners who are, out of work because we're moving towards a new energy environment. We don't care about them. And that's what makes them pissed off.
Scott, I want to stop you there just because this whole variety of topics is why we were unable to get a let's say coherent podcast out of the election one. I think there's just too much to talk about, which is why we tried to constrain this one to structural racism. But I completely agree with all of what you're saying. I think maybe to loop it back to the topic of structural racism, to Scott's point, what we're not saying, what we're not trying to do is trivialize discrepancies in race. And what we're not trying to do is say that all of those discrepancies are based somehow on this magical force of structural racism. What we're trying to say is that as people who care about building an America that gives the best possible version of as close to equal opportunity as we can possibly manifest within this society to to our fellow Americans, we want to get to the bottom of how to solve these problems. And that doesn't mean virtue signaling by talking about white guilt. And it doesn't mean characterizing minority populations. It means a series of really hard conversations about the historical implications of racist policies and the cultural manifestations of detrimental population level impacts. And combining all of that in a way that we can have an open conversation about how we move forward. And so I don't know where we end on this, but
I think you just ended it. I think that was a very good. I think it was a very good wrap up.
Cool. All right. Well, I think there's a lot more to be said, but it's not going to happen here. No. So, especially not after 4 drinks. Yeah. So let's end it there.
All right.
See you next week.
See you next week.